Lupus LA would like to thank our generous sponsors for their support of the Your Story, Our Fight podcast. Emerge Business Solutions serves as a personal and professional CFO for clients across a wide spectrum of industries. They handle financial affairs with integrity and transparency. Gemini Beauty believes in beauty for a cause, and in their case, the cause is lupus. The team at Gemini is changing the skincare game for good. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Lupus LA podcast, Your Story, Our Fight. I'm your host, Adam Selkowitz. As always, I always start the podcast by thanking our sponsors for making this podcast possible. And as we get into season 3 here, I am really thrilled that the response to the podcast has allowed so many of you to reach out to Lupus LA to try to be on the podcast. And our guest today is Victoria Gibbs, and she is exactly like that. Reached out to us after hearing the podcast. So I want to welcome Victoria Gibbs. She is a health and wellness entrepreneur, a yoga expert, a lupus warrior and champion. And I think when you hear her story, the word resilience is going to have a whole new meaning. So welcome to the podcast, Victoria.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Well, thanks for joining us. I know you're jumping into Lupus LA in so many different ways. So I know our audience is going to become really familiar with you soon. So I think this is a really a great opportunity to tell your story to our audience, because I know you just recently wrote a blog for us and you do some yoga stuff but I really want people to understand who you are as a person and what you've been through. So tell us a little bit about, maybe a little bit about before you were diagnosed. Where were you? What were you doing? Where you grew up?
I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and I grew up dancing classical ballet. So my love of movement started from when I was a little girl. And then I went off to Dartmouth College, graduated with a degree in psychology. And like many college grads, wasn't really sure what I was going to do. Dabbled in a couple of different areas, and I ended up finding myself in a finance position at a hedge fund, working in operations and a little bit in investor relations. So not exactly what I had planned, but at the time it was great, and I just kind of needed a focus, and it paid my bills very well. So I was not complaining whatsoever. But something was missing. I had stopped dancing. I had, from my previous years while dancing classical ballet, developed an eating disorder, which obviously, I grew out of, but at the same time still needed something to kind of fill my love of movement. And eventually one day, just leaving work, I found a hot yoga studio and I took class the next day, and I never stopped practicing ever since. During my time at the hedge fund, I also was competing in yoga competitions, which obviously I know sounds very much like an oxymoron, but deep down, it was more so a competition within yourself, more so than the actual competitors or other yogis is probably a better term. But that was actually something that was really great for me and gave me that competitive motivation within myself that I had grown up with. I mean, classical ballet is very competitive, and then to get into an Ivy League was also competitive. So there was just kind of that organic nature that I kind of exude in my day to day. So that was really special, but more so than anything else, I learned so much about my body and learned so much about a lot of the mental obstacles that I tried to just slide under the rug. I actually started to address them, which for me was really pivotal in as far as figuring out who I really wanted to be, who I was, and what really made me happy, because I did things just to please everyone else, but never really did anything for myself. And so yoga really helped navigate that for me. Yeah, I was actually competing or preparing for a competition, I should say, when I was diagnosed with lupus. So that was a very challenging experience for me when it all happened.
So tell me, that's part. So you're doing all of this yoga, you're competing, you've really found kind of a balance between the challenges of work and the balance of yoga. And what is your body, what happens in your body that says, uh-oh, there's a malfunction here?
I think because I have grown up being so active, there's not much that my body can't do. And so when I get on my mat and I start noticing things that, I can't get into my deepest back bends, or I'm kind of crumbling underneath myself while practicing my inversions, I realized something was starting to go awry. And just the amount that I was training in preparation for the national competition at the time, I was really putting in all the hours, but I couldn't keep up anymore physically. I was just exhausted and my joints were hurting. I couldn't do the things that I used to do. And I practice hot yoga and I wasn't sweating in the hot room anymore. So I knew something was very wrong. We practice in 105 degrees with 40% humidity. So I realized I needed to do something, but I was so engrossed in preparation for the competition that I kind of just pushed it aside and said, fight through it. You can do anything. And I could not do anything at that time, unfortunately.
Did you make it to the competition, or the diagnosis came before the competition?
No, I made it to the competition, but I had a fever, I had blood blisters, I had mouth ulcers. I had it all at the time, but I pursued and I motivated and I was like, I've come this far, I've got to do it. And I got on stage and I didn't realize at the time that, extreme sensitivity to light is a symptom of lupus. And so the bright lights came on when I was on the stage and I couldn't see anything. And as I was going through my routine, I couldn't complete any of my postures to their full expression. And I actively crumbled while doing an inversion on the stage. And I just got up gracefully, bowed my head, and I walked off and I didn't practice again for months. And at that time, I thought I might never practice again.
I mean, that's, I guess, mentally devastating, obviously. Did you, at what point did you sort of go to a doctor and say, this may not just be my abilities or my, natural progression, and I need to get this checked out?
The months leading up to that competition was when I really started to exhibit symptoms. But of course, I didn't know what they were at the time, and I didn't want to derail my training. So I was going to urgent care every now and then, hoping that they could help me. And they diagnosed me with the mumps and told me just to go home and rest, and that I had, really severe flu symptoms, which obviously was not the case. And so I listened to them and I just kept pushing along. And I was starting to experience significant brain fog. My father called me at the office one day. And of course, naturally, I recognized his number, I recognized his voice, and I didn't know who I was speaking to. And so at that point in time, he realized something was wrong. And he forced me to come home, but I don't think my parents realized at the time how bad it was. And so once the competition was over, I took 2 trains to get home because I was living out in Huntington at the time. And it was a blessing that I even got home because I was only associating colors. I wasn't able to really read or comprehend or understand, like, I need to get on this train line versus that one. And so when I got to the train station, I just stood there and I didn't recognize my father. I didn't know where I was. I could barely walk at the time. And he took me to see a rheumatologist straight away. He was like, something is devastatingly wrong and I have no idea what it is.
Did he have an expertise in like why did he think you needed a rheumatologist right away?
I'm not sure. My dad is one of those people who just kind of knows everything. And so he was like, this is far beyond any just like regular doctor. And he's very close with all of the doctors at the Princeton Medical Group. And so he just kind of probably made some phone calls even in advance of me coming home and was able to deduce that, I needed to see a rheumatologist.
And so your lupus diagnosis came fairly quickly then once you saw the rheumatologist?
Yeah, I started exhibiting symptoms that February, and by June, I had a diagnosis. And so I was probably exhibiting symptoms long before that, but it didn't get really severe until February 2016, and then diagnosed in June 2016.
And then in terms of, obviously they started you on treatment, and what was sort of the initial recovery? What did that look like?
Yeah, I ended up having to spend the entire summer at home, which for me was completely devastating because I'm someone who is very active. I love to travel. Being physically fit is a big thing for me. And at the time, I wasn't even sure if I would be able to do yoga again. I thought, this is going to be my new normal of just, for me, just being a regular person instead of like a super athlete. And so it was really challenging. I mean, my parents were very obviously loving and supportive, but to have to spend the whole summer at home, kind of in bed, just taking it slow and steady was really hard for me to deal with at the time. So I ended up taking a medical leave from work, which I thought was going to be an issue at the time, but my colleagues actually watched me deteriorate in front of their eyes. And so they were very understanding and accommodating. And they're like, whenever you can come back to us, come back. Your job is here. And I was happy at least because I was still being paid, thankfully, and was able to keep all of my health insurance. So that was a pretty big deal for me.
Excellent. Okay. So I think we're going to take a little break right now, and then we're going to come back and talk about your recovery, your return to yoga, and you recently recovered from open heart surgery. So we're going to talk about all those things right after a quick break.
Please visit our online store at lupusla.org. By purchasing Lupus LA products, you are directly supporting lupus patients and their families. For more information, visit lupusla.org.
Welcome back to the Lupus LA podcast, Your Story, Our Fight. We are talking to Victoria Gibbs, and when we left our story, we were talking about your summer that you had off. So tell me, at the end of this summer, or I guess tell me sort of when the tide changed, when you started to feel better. And then I know you've had some real significant ups and downs, in particular with open heart surgery. And so let's get into that area.
Yeah. So I'd say around September that year, I started to go back to work. I was working part-time and half days. So I would go in every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then just work a half day, which for me was kind of perfect as I was starting to rebuild my energy and stamina and just focus because I hadn't really done too much in that regard over the summer months. And as I started to get more comfortable going back into the office, I started to think that maybe I could get back into my yoga practice. And thankfully, just nice, slow and steady, I took my first yoga class and I just kind of did what I could. I didn't push anything, but I was very lucky that all my skills were still kind of there, which was really nice and reassuring getting back into it. And so I started practicing pretty regularly all over again. And I moved back to Long Island. I was commuting. So my parents are in Princeton and I was staying in Long Island at a relative's. And so I began commuting in and out of the office again, practicing again. And it felt like I was living pretty much what felt like my normal life. And so I was happy to be able to get back into things in that regard. And I actually started preparing to compete again. I am the reigning New York champion for many years. And so I felt like I wanted to get back into that, reclaim my title after all that happened. So I began really focusing on my competitive nature all over again. And I felt a little bit stronger. It's like, I know what's wrong now. I know how to handle it. I can get back into this and, be the best yogi possible. And I managed to win New York competition again, fared very well at nationals. And then I went to internationals, which was awesome. That was held in Beijing, China. And so I felt like, I've made it to internationals. I'm good now. So I eventually stopped competing just because, you get older, and I felt like I had reached my peak and I wanted to end on a high note.
What's interesting to me is how did the yoga and what you get out of yoga, how did that help you with your lupus? I want to make that connection, because I think obviously you sort of were able to manage the lupus in a way that got you back to competing. But tell me how the yoga helps your lupus.
Yoga, I would say, has been the most significant thing for me in terms of managing my lupus. It's been kind of like a mirror for me to understand when my body is functioning well versus when it's not, just based on what I can do on my mat. So if I'm feeling any sort of joint pain or just kind of sluggish, or, I'm noticing that things are inflamed, I kind of take heed and I'm like, okay, this means I need to rest, or this means, just take off a couple of days before getting back into it, because something is brewing inside of my autoimmune system and I don't want to see what it is. And I'd say the mindfulness aspect has been super helpful in terms of understanding how to make that mind-body connection and be more mindful and aware and in tune with my body and with my mind and maintain low stress. I feel that yoga has really just allowed me to calm myself in a way in which that I was never really able to do before. And that is something that I like to share with others, especially in the autoimmune community. I really encourage people to get on their yoga mats, whether it's for 5 minutes or an hour. I feel like every time I get on my yoga mat, I learn something new about myself and my body. And it has really been a great opportunity to kind of be more in tune and aware with exactly what's going on. So anytime that I get on my mat and I'm a little bit inflamed or my joints hurt, I might not necessarily know it just sitting at home. But when I start to move my body, I realize, certain things aren't exactly how I know they should feel, which means I need to take a couple of days off and just rest and focus on my well-being. And the mindfulness aspect is also really pivotal for me. It just really fosters that deep mind-body connection, which I know is kind of challenging for people to necessarily embark on or sit with on a day-to-day basis. And not that you need to practice every day, but being able to tune into your breath and really find that balance, I think, has been even more present whenever I get on my yoga mat. It has just led me to feel and want more healthy things for my lifestyle. Even in terms of food, my body, I feel like, craves healthier food now than when it did prior to me practicing yoga. And even after my diagnosis, I feel like that was even more a catalyst thanks to my practice versus if I was just living a day-to-day life, not focusing on fitness in any regard. And what's great about yoga is that it's gentle. There's no right or wrong. There's no rhyme or reason. The most important thing is to show up. And I think when you can commit to your practice, and even if it's for 5 minutes, you will be able to know exactly what's going on with your body, how it's feeling, and make that connection with your mind. If you're feeling stressed or if, the wheels are just spinning in your head, you'll acknowledge it, you'll realize it, and you'll do the things necessary to kind of bring it back to a more calm and peaceful place.
Excellent. All right. Before we wrap up, I think there's such an important part of your story that we need to tell. And lupus and heart disease go hand in hand, particularly in women. They're studying it in men now too. But I think your story about your heart and your heart surgery and your recovery, I think is a really valuable lesson for people to learn. And so tell me, how did this come about, and sort of give me the rundown of how that happened.
Yeah, the first portion of this year, I got a really bad flare. My body retained 35 pounds of fluid, and on a frame like mine, it's a lot to carry. And so my nephrologist suggested that I get a couple of extra tests done just to make sure that my organs are functioning. And to me, that seemed ridiculous because, I shed the fluid, I felt fine, but I went, I followed instructions as a good patient does. And they initially saw what looked like a small tear in my aorta, and they had me get a heart scan to see how far up it started. And when I got the heart scan, they realized it started at the top, right by my heart, and that I had a aneurysm 8 centimeters in size that was ready to rupture at any given moment. And so for me, that was quite startling. I felt like I was just getting back into my day-to-day life and feeling good and whatnot. And so to get that kind of news really shook me to the core. I just remember that morning kind of, crying on the phone and then calling my parents, and they're like, I hear my mom sobbing in the background, and my doctor at the time was like, you need to go to the ER immediately because, we can't operate necessarily today, but you need to be monitored. And I just knew I couldn't bring myself to go to the ER and spend the weekend. I decided to stay home and just kind of be with myself and my thoughts. And I'm someone through yoga has really found a love for meditating. And so I found that was really helpful for me just to kind of get centered and at peace with what was to come. It's like I'm 38. This is the last thing that I expected, especially because, I feel like I do all of the things, and I never thought that organ damage was a possibility or that lupus and heart disease kind of go hand in hand. Like nobody ever talked to me about that. So there was just a lot of emotions, and going into the hospital and just kind of sitting there for the days leading up to it, trying to put on a brave face and, just be comfortable with what was to happen. I mean, I was terrified, but I knew it was obviously going to save my life and I had to do it. And the recovery after the fact was very challenging initially. Again, because my body retained 35 pounds of fluid all over again because my kidneys weren't functioning properly after the surgery. And so the whole thing just felt very heavy, literally and figuratively, and just trying to come to terms with, is this going to be my summer? Like, I'm just going to be at home doing nothing, like resting and recovering. And, I can't practice yoga. I can barely walk because, everything is just so sensitive and sore. And, it just was a lot harder initially than I thought it was. And I think more so than anything, it was really challenging mentally because there's nothing leading up to it that really made sense to me why this is happening. It just kind of happened. And to think that, my aneurysm could have ruptured and, it's fatal most times. All of it was very frightening. And, I just kind of took it day by day. I tried to make the most of every day. Baby steps, one day at a time, and try to really maintain a positive outlook, because I realized that if I didn't, it could be really detrimental in so many ways and can take me to a dark place. And for me, when I have a flare or something, lupus tends to take me to those dark places. And so I made sure that, you're going to stay positive. You're going to do whatever it takes. And I mean, I did. And I feel like, I can smile about it now and talk about it very openly. But at the time, it was really hard. And I just wasn't sure if I'd even get back to a normal life. Am I going to practice again? Will I ever be able to back bend again? Because that's the focus of my yoga practice. And will I work? And how's that going to look? I'm very grateful that, now it's September, everything has come back to normal. Like, my body is functioning. I can do all of the things. And, I have my little scar and I kind of love it. I think it's a great accessory. And I'm really just grateful. And I just want people to realize that, anything can really happen with lupus. It is the most unpredictable thing I have ever come across in my life, or even really heard of, to be completely honest. And so the more we can do to just speak up and educate and share and ask all of the questions, I think it's a game changer.
You put a really amazing button on that story with your advice. And I know you're going to be a familiar face to the Lupus LA community. And I'm glad you're doing so well. We are thrilled to have you on board. And I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to me and talk to our community. So I look forward to many great things ahead and lots of good health for you in the future.
Thank you. This was a wonderful opportunity to share, and I'm so glad I reached out to you guys, because it's been nothing but positive vibes in my life. So thank you so much.
On behalf of the entire team at Lupus LA, we thank you for joining the Your Story, Our Fight podcast. Please tune in, spread the word, and come back for more inspiring lupus stories. I'm your host, Adam Selkowitz, wishing you good health, and to always remember, your story is our fight.